Hey guys, Devin here with Admiral Off-Road, and today we're going to be installing the Spartan locker in our Jeep Cherokee. Let's get started. Before we get started, let's go over all the tools we'll need for this project. You're going to need a catch pan to catch all the fluid that comes out. You'll need 2 jack stands, a jack, some anti-seize, 2 bottles of gear oil, some brake cleaner. I use an impact gun. It's not necessary, but it definitely makes things a lot easier. A pry bar, a torque wrench, a pair of needle nose pliers, some red or blue Loctite, a punch, some RTV or a gasket, assorted sockets including a 3/4 inch socket, an 11/16 socket, a 13mm 6-point and a 13mm 12-point, as well as a 5/8 socket. You'll also need a breaker bar and a ratchet. Assorted hammers, including a dead blow, is probably a good idea. That way you don't damage anything inside of the differential. The first step will be to jack up the Jeep and remove the wheels and tires. With the tires off the Jeep and it safely on jack stands, the next thing we're going to do is remove the brakes. Now I'm going to move you back here so you can get a better view, but they're held on with 2 13mm bolts, and you'll do this for both sides. We're sitting behind the caliper now. You can see the 2 13mm bolts that hold it on. They can be recognized with these 2 rubber boots. With those 2 bolts removed, we should now be able to remove the caliper and the brake disc. When you remove your brake caliper, you want to support it so it's not being held up by your brake line. I'm just going to wrap a couple of bungee cords and attach it to here. Now that we have the caliper out of the way, you should be able to remove your brake disc. Sometimes these like to get stuck on there. I just recently did my brakes, so it comes off pretty easy. While you're in here, now's a good time to take a look at all your brake parts, just since you're in here anyway. Take a look at your brake pads, take a look at your disc. You also want to wear gloves for this part. You don't want to get all the oil from your hands on your brake disc. It's just not good for it. Now that we've got the brake disc out of the way, we can go ahead and remove the axle shaft. We're going to remove it with the wheel bearing attached right now. Now's a great time to see if you need to replace your wheel bearings. You can kind of check, see if there's any extra play in them. I know I recently replaced this one, so I'm just going to remove it all as a single unit. But if you do need to replace this, it's pretty easy. It's just basically an extra bolt here from what we're already doing. But this whole unit right now is going to be held on with 3 13mm 12-point bolts. So you're going to need a 12-point socket for this one. Again, 13mm. Here we can see 2 of the 3 bolts that are holding on our hub, which is attached to the axle shaft. You can see one up here, one down here, and then there's one around back. Like I said, these are 12-point. Don't try and use your 6-point socket on there. You're just going to end up stripping it. So go ahead and take the time, use the right tool, get a 12-point socket. There's 2, and the third one is around back. Yeah, and everything's coming apart pretty easy on this since I did recently replace this hub. Just be prepared, these might be pretty stuck. Anti-seize is definitely going to be your friend when putting all this back together. There we go. So you can see after I removed those 3 13mm bolts, we can slide the whole assembly out and the axle shaft comes with it. Because we need to remove the carrier to install our locker, we're going to have to remove our tie rod as well. There just isn't going to be enough room with this tie rod in place. I'm going to remove it just from this one side. Shouldn't be too much of an issue. We're going to go ahead and take off the cotter pin first and then remove the castle nut. Now's a good time to inspect all of your steering boots as well. This one's obviously split. And I'm going to be replacing the steering pretty soon, so I'm not too worried about it, but obviously this would be a great time to go ahead and replace these boots as well. With the pin out of the way, now we can go ahead and remove the castle nut. It's going to be with a 3/4 inch socket. Now we can go ahead and remove the diff cover. I've got my catch pan underneath, and this is held on with 13mm bolts. The impact socket didn't really want to fit, so we're just going to go by hand. We're going to leave the top bolt loosely attached when I whack it with a hammer. That way we can go ahead and drain all the fluid without dropping the diff cover into the fluid as well. With the diff cover off, we can go ahead and take a look at everything we've got going on here. Now it's very important, you want to take note before we remove everything of what side your bearing caps are on. Everything has to go back exactly as it came off. So I can see that this one has a 3.9 at the bottom, this one's a 3.4. Just be a great idea to take a picture of this. You can see, see the markings, but obviously just try and keep track of it after you take everything off. But everything has to go back on exactly the way it came off. So again, figure out which way up this goes, which side it is for both of them before removing it. These are going to be a 5/8 bolt. We're going to take out all four, remove the bearing caps, and then we can go ahead and pull out the carrier. So again, I'm going to put this down exactly like this so I can just pick it up and put it back on exactly the way it came off. Now that we've got the bearing caps off, we can go ahead and remove our carrier. Now again, there are going to be some shims and some bearings in here that we've got to keep on the same side they came out. So very important, you don't just want to let it crash out and everything fall down. So we're going to be careful when we pull this out. All right, so I've seen other people do this, and for the most part, the carrier, you can just kind of pull it right out. This has a pretty fresh set of gears in it, so I'm thinking this might just be a little bit tighter because it hasn't been worn in as much. I don't know, but I've really been struggling trying to pull this out. I actually just turned the camera off and have been pulling on it. So I think I'm gonna have to use the pry bar, which is definitely not what you want to have to do, but it's just not coming out by hand. So I'm gonna try and protect everything as much as possible. Definitely try not to have to do this, I guess, but looks like it's the only way it's gonna come out. So we'll try and protect it as much as best we can. Go. All right, there's our carrier. Now that the axle housing is basically empty, it's a great time to go ahead and check your axle tube seals and everything. Now again, these are brand new, but now again, since we've got everything apart anyway, now would be a great time if these are leaking to go ahead and replace those. The next thing we're gonna have to do is drive out a pin that holds in the cross shaft. I can show you here. I don't know if you can see the cross shaft right there that holds in the spider gears in place. There's a pin that holds that in place, and you have to drive it out through that hole. I got a set of punches. They're not going to work for me. They're actually just a little bit too thick there. So I just had to find something else to drive that pin out. And we'll go ahead and do that now. There we go. There's the pin. Make sure you don't lose that. And now we're going to go ahead and take off all the bolts that hold the ring gear to our carrier. Before we take the bolts off, we want to make sure we make a mark on here somewhere that we can make sure everything lines back up when we go to put it back together. Then we'll go ahead and take all the bolts off. These are going to be 11/16. It looks like somebody had already, when they put it together, made 3 marks over here and it lines up. So I'm just going to use that, but definitely make sure you make a mark. If you're not doing this with an impact, you're definitely going to have to put this in a vise. I think with the impact we should be all right. Just keep it out here on the hand. All right, with all the bolts removed, we can go ahead and remove the ring gear from that and put that aside. Now that we've gotten the ring gear out of the way and we've already driven out the pin that holds in this cross shaft, we should be able to drive the cross shaft out and then remove our spider gears. I've got the carrier in my vise now, being careful not to damage anything inside. I'm going to drive out this cross shaft. There we go, there's the cross shaft out. Now we should be able to remove our spider gears. With the cross shaft out, now we can go ahead and remove our spider gears. Now, depending on what kind of a locker you're using, you may or may not have to keep some of the shims that are in place here. With our Spartan locker, we don't, so we want to make sure we get them all out with it. So all I'm going to do is go ahead and just turn the spider gears here, and I can pull them out. And then same thing from the ends, I'm just going to pull them straight out here. And again, we want to make sure we get the shims with it. There we go, that one has a shim as well. And this one I can see has it on the back. And this one as well. So we've got all the shims out. So we've got our empty carrier now. We're going to be ready to go ahead and put in our locker. All right, before we get started, let's go ahead and see what actually comes in the Spartan locker box. So we've got some of the pins and springs, a couple of cam gears, our new cross shaft, and again, some more gears that are going to go in there. The first part in setting up our locker is going to be putting our pins and springs into our locking rings here. Now I've done it already on this locking ring, and I'll show you how to do it on the other one. First thing we're going to do is we're just going to use a little tiny bit of grease on this, just to kind of pre-lube everything up and just help hold everything together while we're assembling it. I'm going to put the spring and the pin just like this, with the pin facing up into the hole. I'm going to take one of these little pins that they give us as well. I'm going to push down, and there's a hole that I can put the pin in, and that's going to lock that in place. Now, once this is loaded up like that, I don't want to pull this out. That's going to shoot that pin out, and you're never going to find it in your garage. I'll do the same thing on the other one. So just kind of grease it up a little bit. Put the spring in. Push it down. And lock it in place with the pin. So now these are both ready to go. The next thing we're going to do is prep and install these two gears here. They're going to go up in top and down below where the ring gear sits. Doesn't matter, these are exactly the same, so you're not going to get one switch with the other, but we'll go ahead and install those. Before we do though, I want to lube them up with a little bit of grease here, again, just to keep everything nice and lubed up, and it'll also help hold everything together while we're installing it. Again, not too much, just enough. There we go. I'll turn this sideways here so we can see. Now with this setup here, what we're going to do is go ahead and install our locking gears. So you want these teeth to be able to mesh up with these. So we're going to kind of turn it a little bit, just that way we can get these pins through as well. We're going to do the ring gear side first. And these are two different pieces. We want to make sure we keep this going this way. So it's kind of cupped. We're going to keep the cups the same way it came out of the packaging. So there's one of them, one piece to go. Again, same thing, we'll lube it up a little bit first. And the next part, we're going to have to line up this groove with, there'll be a groove in here, because that's where the cross pin will go. So it seems to be having a little bit of an issue with this pin here. I'm going to cut it down just with some wire cutters. Still should be able to pull the pin out, but it's hitting the inside here. It's not letting me slide it in. So let's go ahead and fix that right now. There we go. So that did seem to be the issue. That was easy. Just make sure you do clip these. That way you can get it all installed correctly. Now that we've got everything in place, we can go ahead and put in our new cross shaft. This is what comes with the Spartan locker. Now there's only one way to put this in. It's got a hole for the roll pin that holds everything in place. So if I turn here, you can see this is where the roll pin goes through. So this is going to have to fit in this way. This is also flared out a little bit more on this side. So this is the side that you're going to start it in, and you're going to push it out this way. I did have to end up trimming a lot of the wires to get everything to fit and turn correctly to be able to line everything up. So just keep that in mind that, yeah, you're probably going to have to trim everything. All right, there we go. Now I got the holes lined up. Put it on the side. So again, this is the side that doesn't have the hole for the roll pin in it. It's just solid, so I'm going to pound it from this side. There we go. We want to seat that all the way, so make sure you push it until it stops. There we go. Sounds like we're bottomed out. We're good to go. Next thing we're going to do is go ahead and pull out these retaining pins. You can see now that they've been removed, the little pin is pushed up in here, and this is locked into place. Part of the reason why I'm doing this is I'm going to use some Loctite on these bolts holding on the ring gear, so I just want to make sure they have something clean to stick to. There we go, all clean, ready for reassembly. We're back in the vise now, ready to put the ring gear back on the housing. I don't know if you can see on camera, but I've got the 3 line marks that were made lined up with the 3 marks that were here in the housing, so I know that we're putting it back on the exact way it came off. And before we put these on, we're going to use a little bit of Loctite on here just to make sure nothing comes apart. And we're also going to make sure we torque this down to spec. So we'll go ahead and go finger tight first. And we're going to go in a star pattern, so going across, make sure we tighten it down evenly and everything lines up nice and straight. Now that we've got everything finger tight on here, we're going to go ahead and start torquing it down again in that star pattern. I've seen a couple different torque specs on this, anywhere from like 55, I think I've seen all the way up to 80. I used some red Loctite, so I think I'm just going to go 55, but I'm not going to go straight there. I think I'm going to go like maybe 20, then 40, and then 55, something like that, just to, again, so we're not having anything get all cockeyed or anything like that. Again, this is going to be spinning really fast all the time in this Jeep, so I got to make sure it does go on straight. So like I said, again, I'm going to go ahead and kind of slowly step it up, again, starting at probably around 20 or 30 and going from there in a few different steps. Okay, that's everything to 20. We'll go ahead and step it up to 40 and do that again. All right, and finally 55. All right, there we go. Got everything torqued up. We're ready to go ahead and put this back into the Jeep. All right, with everything put back together, we're ready to go ahead and reinstall our diff. I got the bearing caps put back on here, made sure they went back on the same sides. We're gonna go ahead and slide it in. Just want to check every once in a while, make sure this is meshing up nicely with the pinion gear back there, that we're not just smashing it into there. Looks like we've got some good engagement going. Want to make sure I'm using a dead blow hammer, not something that I'm really going to mess anything up if I whack it too hard. Now that we've got the carrier in place, we can go ahead and put our bearing caps back on. Now again, like I said before, they have to go on the exact same way they came off. So this is the correct side, the right way up. I'm also going to add a little bit of thread locker again, just to make sure we hold everything in place. All right, now again, before I really tighten everything down, I'm just going to take a look at the picture I took beforehand and just check to make sure everything is exactly the right spot before I tighten it all down and make it permanent. Now that I've double checked that I make sure I've got everything in the correct place, I'm going to start tightening everything down. Again, it's a 5/8 socket to do this, and I'm going to torque these down to 60 foot-pounds. Again, just like putting the bolts on, I'm not just going to go straight to 60. I'm going to kind of do it in steps. So I've got this set at 20 first. We'll go 20, 40, and then 60. Go. There's 20. There's 40. There we go. Those are all torqued down. Now we can clean up this mating surface here and reinstall our diff cover. All right, we're just going to go ahead and scrape all the old gasket off this so we can get a good seal and make sure we don't have any leaks. There we go, that looks pretty good. We'll do the same thing with the diff cover and then we'll be ready to install it. All right, now that we've got the diff cover pretty well cleaned, we're gonna go ahead and use some RTV. Now you can definitely use a gasket. Some people really prefer those. I've never had any issues with leaking with the RTV, so I'm just gonna keep using that. It's real cheap. Gonna put a nice generous amount on there though. We're definitely gonna have to let this dry a little bit before we put our diff fluid in. So. All right, I let the RTV sit for a minute or so, just kind of tack up a little bit. Now we're just gonna put this in loosely by hand. We're not gonna tighten anything down quite yet. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and let this dry for a little bit. While we're doing that, we'll go ahead and assemble the rest of the, put the axle shafts back in, put the tires back on, just kind of get everything set up for us to to fill up and be done. All right, next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna put the axle back in the housing here. Now we're gonna have to line up these splines with the splines of the differential. So it's gonna take a little bit of lining up. You might have to take your time with it. You also don't want to just drag it up against the bottom of the axle tube here. There's an axle seal in there, so you want to kind of guide it in, try and keep it right at the center, so that way you're not going to push that axle seal out of the way. Go. So I can see everything turning here. Looks like we are all lined up. And got these holes lined up. So we'll go ahead and put in our 13 millimeter bolts. Now again, I'm going to use some anti-seize on this just to make this easier to take apart if I ever have to do it again, because these things will get seized in there if you don't. So before I put these in, we'll put a little bit of anti-seize on it. Same thing with these, we're going to go ahead and torque them down in a couple of stages. The torque specs on these are 75 foot-pounds for these three. We'll go ahead and do them in stages again, so we'll do 25, 50, and then 75. All right, now that that's done, we'll go ahead and put the brakes back on. Got my gloves on for this part. I don't want to get the oils, especially now that I've been working with some grease and diff fluid and stuff. I definitely don't want to get that on any of my brake components. Let's go ahead and put the brake disc on first. There we go. And then we'll put on our caliper and we'll torque it down to 12 foot-pounds. Now that we've got the brake caliper put on, we'll go ahead and tighten them down with these two bolts here. Again, 13 millimeter. Wouldn't hurt to put a little bit of grease in here as well, just to help them slide back and forth. Okay, there we go. There's 12 foot-pounds. And 12 foot-pounds. All right, now we've got all this torqued up. We're almost done. We'll do the same thing on the other side. So again, we'll put the axle shaft back in. We'll put the brake parts back all together. Then all we have left to do is to reattach the steering, fill up the differential, make sure we got all the bolts tight, put the tires on, and we'll be ready to drive. Now that we have the axle shafts and the brakes all done, I'm gonna go ahead and tighten this down a little bit more, and we'll fill this up first. We're gonna do it before we put the tie rod back on and the tires back on, just because it's gonna be a lot easier to get to this fill hole without everything in the way. Right, and I'm going to be using some ADW90. It's always a good idea after you install something new like this, you know, let it break in for a little bit and then change the fluid after a few hundred miles. So that's going to be my plan here. And we're just going to fill it until it starts to drip out of the hole here, so I've got my catch pan underneath when that time comes. All right, and there we are, full there. So that took, this bottle wasn't completely full. So a little bit over. You know, if you get two quarts of this, you should be fine. And I think this one might have a little bit more capacity than a stock one. All right, so there's the differential finished up. So now we'll go ahead and put the steering back on, put the tires back on, and we'll be able to put it on the ground. All right, we'll go ahead and reinstall our tie rod now. Perfect, and then we just got to make sure we have the hole lined up here so we can put the cotter pin through. All right, last thing to do is just to put the tires on, and then we should be good to go. Before we go ahead and put this on the ground, let's take a look at how the locker works. So when you turn a corner, your inside tire is going to be traveling slower than your outside tire. So if these were always locked together, you get hopping and a lot of scrubbing, and you really go through tires pretty quick. So the reason we do a locker instead of just welding the differential is it allows one tire to spin while the other one doesn't. So it does, you'll hear that clicking. That's the locker disengaging and allowing one tire to spin faster than the other. So while it's not under power, I can spin one tire and leave the other tire alone. But if I go under here and I turn the drive shaft, both tires are going to be spinning the same direction at the same time. So they're both getting power now. Alright guys, that's going to do it for today. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them down below. And if you like what you saw here, please like and subscribe.